I've already lost my grandma. This is this is my dad.
Accused of shooting 4 people, killing his girlfriend, her mother Mary Lubin, and his best friend John.
August 28, 2025. Inside Florida State Prison, the needle slid into the arm of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades waiting to die. His name was Curtis Windom, and his story remains one of the most disturbing in Florida's modern history. Back in 1992, Windom's rage turned a quiet suburban neighborhood into a war zone. He murdered 3 people in cold blood, and left a community forever haunted by the sound of gunfire. Neighbors watched in terror as Windom, armed and unrelenting, tore through lives that had nothing to do with his anger. For years, his case was a battlefield. Lawyers claimed he was mentally unstable, others called him pure evil. His appeals dragged on, but every court upheld one conclusion: that his crimes were so brutal, so calculated, that death was the only sentence. And so, nearly 30 years later, the state of Florida carried out its promise. But the questions didn't die with him. Was this justice? Or was it vengeance dressed as law? Did his execution bring closure to the families, or did it reopen wounds that never healed? In this story, we'll trace the night Curtis Windom erupted in violence, the trial that sealed his fate, the decades he spent behind bars, and the chilling details of his final hours, including what he ate, what he said, and how the world chose to remember him. On October 3, 1992, Curtis Windom's anger boiled over. Friends later recalled him seething about Johnny Lee, a man he claimed owed him $2,000. That morning, when Windom learned Lee had just won cash at the dog track, his response was chilling.
"You're gonna read about me."
Hours later, he walked into a Walmart in Ocoee, bought a revolver and 50 rounds of ammunition, and left with only one goal: to settle his grudges with blood. His first stop was Johnny Lee. Windom drove up, raised the gun, and shot him twice in the back. Then, as Lee collapsed, Windom stepped out of the car, stood over him, and fired 2 more shots into his body. It wasn't random violence, it was an execution carried out in broad daylight. Next, Windom turned his fury toward Valerie Davis, his on-and-off girlfriend and the mother of one of his children. He stormed into her apartment and, without hesitation, shot her in the chest. Valerie died where she stood, leaving behind a daughter who would grow up without her mother. On the street outside, Kenneth Williams crossed paths with Windom. He was an innocent man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Windom fired again, striking him in the chest. Williams survived, but barely, a wound that would scar him for life. Mary Lubin, Valerie's mother, had rushed from work after hearing that her daughter had been shot. As she sat at a stop sign near the scene, Windom walked up to her car. Witnesses said he leaned in, spoke a few words, then raised his gun and fired twice. Mary died instantly. In the span of a single rampage, Windom murdered 3 people: his girlfriend, her mother, and a man he believed had crossed him, while leaving another man critically wounded. The motive was a toxic mix of money, rejection, and rage. To prosecutors, it was clear: Windom's need for control and vengeance turned an ordinary October day into one of Winter Garden's darkest tragedies. When the gunfire stopped, Winter Garden was a war zone. 3 people lay dead, 1 clung to life, and dozens of neighbors had witnessed the rampage. Police moved quickly. Within hours, Curtis Windom was in custody. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. After the chaos he had unleashed, Windom was taken without resistance. The charges came swiftly: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and weapons charges. Prosecutors promised to seek the death penalty from the very beginning. In court, the case against him was overwhelming. Forensic evidence tied the revolver he had purchased that morning directly to the bullets found in the victims. And the sheer brutality of the killings, standing over Johnny Lee to fire again, ambushing Valerie Davis in her own home, executing Mary Lubin in her car, painted a picture of a man acting with intent, not impulse. The defense had little room to maneuver. They raised questions about his mental state, about whether Windom's long history of unstable behavior might make him less culpable. But the jury was unmoved. After a swift deliberation, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued that the murders were premeditated, calculated, and carried out with cold precision. The jury agreed. Curtis Windom was sentenced to death. In that moment, the law had spoken, but the families of Valerie Davis, Mary Lubin, and Johnny Lee knew their long fight for justice had only just begun. Because in Florida, a death sentence doesn't end a story. It begins decades of appeals, legal battles, and waiting. After the sentence was read, Curtis Windom was transferred to Florida State Prison, the place where most of the state's condemned men wait out their final years. For Windom, those years turned into decades. Nearly 30 years passed between his sentencing in the early 1990s and the day the execution warrant was finally signed. During that time, Windom became one of the most notorious names on Florida's death row. His attorneys fought relentlessly, claiming he suffered from serious mental health problems, that he didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions, that the state had ignored mitigating evidence. But each time, the courts pushed back. Judges pointed to the sheer brutality of his crimes, execution-style shootings, deliberate targeting, the killing of both a girlfriend and her mother. To the state, this wasn't a man who had lost control. It was a man who had made a choice. Inside prison, Windom developed a reputation for being quiet, even withdrawn. Unlike some inmates who lash out or build a following, he faded into the routine of confinement. He spent his days in a small cell, cut off from the world, with only short breaks for exercise in the yard. Outside those prison walls, his name occasionally resurfaced in debates about the death penalty itself. Opponents argued that leaving a man on death row for nearly 30 years was cruel in itself, a punishment beyond the sentence. Supporters countered that the delay was his own doing, appeal after appeal that kept justice from being carried out. For Windom, the decades slipped away in monotony, but the shadow of the execution chamber never disappeared. He knew that one day, the governor's signature would arrive, and when it did, all the appeals, all the waiting, all the arguments would end in a single night. By late August 2025, the decades of appeals were exhausted. The Florida Supreme Court had signed off, clemency was denied, and Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. Curtis Windom's execution date was set, August 28, 2025. For Windom, it meant the countdown had begun. In the hours leading up to an execution, Florida follows a strict routine. The condemned inmate is moved to a holding cell near the death chamber. Guards monitor him constantly. Phone calls are restricted to family, clergy, or attorneys. Meals are offered, though many inmates barely touch their food. Windom, however, did request a last meal. Reports confirm he ordered a simple choice: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread, the kind of Southern comfort food that, for some, carries a taste of childhood. He was visited by a prison chaplain. Witnesses later said Windom appeared quiet, almost distant. The atmosphere was tense, a reminder that even in 2025, executions in America remain one of the most divisive practices in the justice system. Just before 6 p.m., guards entered his cell. They shackled his hands and feet, read him the formal notice, and escorted him down the short, final walk. As the clock struck 6 p.m. on August 28, 2025, Curtis Windom entered the death chamber at Florida State Prison. The man who once stormed through a neighborhood with gunfire was now shackled to a gurney, surrounded by silence and the eyes of witnesses. Now, as he lay strapped down, a warden asked the final question: "Do you have any last words?" Witnesses reported that Windom paused, lifted his head slightly, and spoke only a few lines. He did not apologize, nor did he express regret in the way some condemned men have. At 6:04 p.m., the warden gave the signal. The first of 3 chemicals began flowing through the 4 lines in his arms. Windom's body stiffened, then relaxed. Within minutes, his chest no longer rose. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside, reactions split sharply. Among protesters outside the prison, chants rang out, some condemning the death penalty as state-sanctioned murder, others demanding more executions for killers like Windom. Even in death, his name stirred division. The execution of Curtis Windom closed a chapter that had been open since the early 1990s. 3 people lost their lives in one of the most senseless outbursts of violence Florida had ever seen: Valerie Davis, a young mother whose daughter grew up without her; Mary Lubin, a grandmother who tried to protect her family; and Johnny Lee, a man killed over a debt. A fourth, Kenneth Williams, survived his wounds, but carried the scars for life. For their families, August 28, 2025, was supposed to bring closure. Yet closure is rarely simple. Some left the prison that night believing justice had finally been served. Others admitted the execution did not erase decades of grief or the emptiness left behind. Windom's story also highlights the contradictions of America's death penalty system. He committed his crimes in a single night of rage, but it took 33 years for the state to carry out his sentence. During that time, appeals, motions, and debates stretched across generations. To some, that's proof of fairness, the system giving every chance before taking a life. To others, it's cruelty on both sides, for the inmate waiting in limbo, and for the victims' families forced to relive the crime year after year. In the end, Curtis Windom's life ended with lethal injection, not gunfire. The final question lingers: does execution balance the scales of justice, or is it simply one more tragedy added to the pile? If you want to hear more stories like this, of crime, punishment, and the final chapters written inside America's prisons, subscribe and stay with us. Because behind every execution, there is always more than just a crime, there is a story.